I had no idea I was going to be going up against Vitalik today. That's pretty hardcore. But thanks for everyone that wanted to come hang out with me here today. My name is Nader Dabit. I'm a developer, I'm an author, and I'm a teacher. And I work as a developer relations engineer with Edge and Node. And actually with Celestia now. I was previously with Edge and Node. Celestia is the first modular blockchain network. I've been a developer for almost 11 years now. I've worked in a few different areas of expertise. I've been a front-end developer, and then I moved into mobile development for about 4 years. I then went to cloud computing, where I worked at AWS for a little over 3 years. And then I got into the blockchain world a year and a half ago, where I worked with Edge and Node, like I mentioned, for about a year, a little over a year. And now I'm working with Celestia. So that's my background. Today I'm going to be talking about the Web3 tech stack. And for me, coming into the blockchain space, it was a huge shift to kind of understand how to go from building traditional web, mobile, whatever cloud applications to building applications on decentralized networks and protocols, because there's so much nuance and so many differences, and there's so many things that are actually kind of too early for us to do all of the things that we want. And there's a lot of noise out there. I think there are a lot of people that work at these different protocols that are often talking about what their protocol will ultimately do one day, but you don't often get the actual real truth about what you can do today. And I don't really like that, honestly. So I'm hoping we can get more people that are kind of more pragmatic about the things that are happening in this space. So for Web3, when we talk about this in general, a lot of people also kind of often talk about like a utopia. And I think that we're all optimists here, I think, and we all think that this technology is going to be making the world a better place in general, but we also need to be a little bit more realistic about where we are today. And the way I look at Web3 versus now where we want to be is something like along the spectrum. I think we're somewhere around between the second and the third hand. It's kind of an evolution. We're trying to kind of get to the end product. And to get there, we need to be realistic about where we are today. What is Web3? I like this definition a lot. Web3 is the stack of protocols that enable fully decentralized applications. When we talk about, this is from the perspective of a developer, when we talk about Web3 though, we often talk about the characteristics that are enabled by these protocols. So decentralization of ownership as well as actual software infrastructure, native payments, displaced intermediaries, robust infrastructure, which to me means if 90% of the network goes down, my application still runs, whereas on AWS, if USC1 goes down, everyone's application goes down. Self-sovereign identity, open composable backends. The things that really interest me the most are kind of on the right side here. So open composable backends that are free to consume and open by nature and trust minimized. Because for me as a developer, I really thought the idea of being able to use other people's code, other people's applications, and other people's data the same way I used to use other people's code in open source was a really powerful idea, because I no longer needed to trust that their API was going to work the next day. APIs like Twitter are very, very well known for offering, ways for you to build applications on top of them, but they can actually change their API the next day and shut your business down. So you can't really rely on these APIs in the Web 2 world to build businesses on. But what if we had data and APIs and infrastructure that we could use that we knew was going to be around a year, 5 years down the road, that we can actually kind of put together and compose like building blocks? Most of Web3 data is just free to consume. We can all read it, we can all use it. There is no barrier to kind of doing that. And everything is kind of open by nature. So when I started diving into all this stuff, one of the things that I wanted to do was understand how to distill all of this information to make it approachable for the average developer. I am in developer relations, meaning that I kind of often try to go out of my way to help new developers understand technology. I help developers learn how to build stuff. I am basically a combination of teacher and developer, and also writer. You do all sorts of things. You speak at events like this. But really, the one thing I kept hearing from new developers coming into the space is how confusing it all was. Because if you look at some of the things that people put out there for developers, and they say, oh, this is the Web3 stack. And you look at this, and each one of these technologies alone, if you really wanted to understand them in depth, might take you months. So imagine telling someone new to kind of come in and understand all this stuff. It's really, really, really confusing. So what I wanted to do was try to distill this knowledge into something a little bit more approachable, still a little bit verbose, still quite a bit of stuff there, but I think it's a little bit more approachable, trying to kind of categorize some of this stuff. This is an iteration of something that we've been working on for a year and a half, I guess you could say. There's a couple of areas I'd still like to add to this that I'm going to go over in just a moment, but we kind of start on the left with different types of blockchains. We move into these different primitives that you can kind of think of. And from the perspective of a developer, it's really easy, I think, when you kind of categorize these things and give people places to start. Now, they might not look at this and use all of these things or use the exact things that I'm showing here, but this is a good introduction, I think. And then once people kind of feel confident that they can build stuff, they might then go into other areas, I guess you could say. So let's dive into this a little bit more. From the traditional web infrastructure point of view, if I wanted someone to build an application at AWS, almost every application that had ever been built, with me at least, in my experience, could kind of be 95% of the functionality could be bucketed into these three areas. You have compute, meaning you have some type of server or something somewhere that actually allows you to write code and things like that. You have some type of identity and authentication, authorization mechanism that was built into that. You also had a database, so you needed either a SQL database or a NoSQL database or whatever types of database that you had. And you needed some way to store files like images and videos. And then you needed a place to host your application. Now, using these things, you could basically build anything or get 95% of the way there. So if you wanted to build Facebook or some type of social media application, the mental model is really easy to put together. But in Web3, it looks a lot different. You have some of these similar building blocks, but you also have a lot of nuances and differences. One of them is that public and open data and APIs are not what we're used to. We're used to having siloed, brittle APIs and data and databases and things that could literally just break one day over the next. And the idea of all of the data being public is actually really, really hard to understand, because a lot of people tell you can build everything in Web3 that you can in Web2. It's not true at all. Instead, you need to understand like where this stuff makes sense and where you would use it and where you wouldn't use it, because I don't see Web3 as like a replacement to everything that we've ever done. Instead, we have new primitives and we can actually build new things that we couldn't before in the past. We might disrupt certain things, but we're not disrupting everything. You have this idea of indexing and querying data from the blockchain, because when you have data stored on-chain, it's actually stored in a series of blocks. You can't just go read historical data or anything like that. You need a way to kind of get all of this information and make it easily accessible by your user interfaces and by your applications. You have smart contracts, of course, and you have native digital payments. So these are kind of the differences, I would say. You still need identity and authentication. You still need file storage. You still need a way to host your web applications. So we're going to dive into some of these areas. So in the Web3 tech stack, the graph is a protocol I used to work very closely with. And the graph is an indexing and querying protocol that allows developers to define a network that they want to query from. And they define a data model in GraphQL. And then the graph actually goes and indexes all of the data from that network or that smart contract that they want to index. And then basically just gives them like a really nice GraphQL API that they can read from. So beyond that, so once you have your indexing and querying set up, you could use the graph. There's a couple of other options out there, but the graph is probably a great place to start. There's also this idea of off-chain and peer-to-peer data. So when we think of data in Web3, for the most part, we're often thinking of data on-chain, but there are also a few protocols out there that are kind of doing interesting stuff that you could consider, at least right now, off-chain. And I think Ceramic Network has spent a lot of time thinking about how this works, and they have a great place to start if you're interested in that. For video and video streaming, you might want to build something like Twitch. How would you do that in Web3? LivePeer is definitely a good place to start. They have a really great and inexpensive protocol that is Web3, and it allows you to build those types of applications. For file storage, we have a lot of differences, I think, from Web 2, because in Web 2, you store something like an S3 and your video or image or whatever could actually be deleted, or maybe you forget to pay your hosting and it goes away. But I think we have more permanence in Web3, which is really cool. We have different degrees of permanence. So with IPFS, you store a file and it's now available on this network. No one can delete it, but it might actually go away if you don't actually pin it. So it's not permanent, but it's more permanent, I would say, than a traditional database. You can make it more permanent by using something like Filecoin or a pinning service, but all of this data will still be publicly accessible if someone has the hash. One of the more interesting protocols to me, though, that really has gotten me excited about Web3 is Arweave. Arweave is the first protocol that treats files like it does on-chain data. So when you store data on Ethereum, you know that that data is going to be there forever. But you couldn't store a file like an image or a video, it would be too expensive. So Arweave is essentially just that. It's a protocol that allows you to store files and videos forever. And by forever, I think they give a number of like 100 to 200 years. But you pay a single transaction cost, and the network uses that and enables that mechanism to be stored and retrieved forever, which is really interesting. You can also build out actual front single-page applications on Arweave, meaning you have like a permanent application. So you can literally write a React application or a Vue application, upload it to Arweave, and that application will be available forever. So what about for version control? We saw a lot of things happen this year with censorship. So we had GitHub repos being taken down. We had people, a lot of things that happened. Well, if you wanted to have a backup, if you wanted to have a way to kind of build in the same way using Git, the protocol, but using a decentralized version of a hosted version of that, I guess you could say, Radical offers that. It's actually really nice. They have a new CLI that works really well, and I would definitely recommend checking it out. This is something that everyone here probably is very familiar with, but often I give this talk to more like non-Web3 people, but identity is basically a wallet. And I think that the problem with the current state of identity in Web3 is that it's so closely tied to finance. The people that are doing the most interesting stuff with wallets right now, to me, are trying to kind of abstract away the financial part and talk about identity. And I don't even know if the word wallet is even like a good term. But yeah, there's all types of wallets out there. The three most, or I would say three of the most popular ones, and the ones that I like the most, are MetaMask and Rainbow for EVM, and then Phantom for Solana. There's a lot of stuff happening with identity. So these are just a few of the different projects that are out there that I have personally actually tried that I would recommend considering. So self.id is an actual implementation on the Ceramic network that allows you to build out identities based on decentralized identifiers. And what this basically does is it attaches an DID to your address and then allows you to make an update to that ID based on some schema. And the schema is something like whatever you want to provide, actually. You could say something like my username or my email, but you don't have to provide that. And then the applications using that schema would then retrieve that information from Ceramic, and you have full control over what's stored there, and it's almost like you have a single place to change your information, and then all the applications would then connect to that. A few other great options I think that are kind of interesting. Bright ID is kind of like a combination maybe of like Web 2, quote unquote, and Web 3. They have a way to do Sybil resistant identities, but it has to do with KYC, I believe. Still kind of interesting the way that they're doing it. Spruce ID and then Polygon ID. For development environments, if you're looking to just like spin up an actual Solidity or maybe a Solana project, you might check out Anchor on Solana. I really like Foundry and Hardhat on the EVM. And you also have Truffle, which has been around a lot longer than probably any of those. For access control and private data, Lit protocol is actually really, really nice. It's something that I've used a couple of times. It allows you to encrypt anything that you would like to, and it provides a protocol and SDKs and stuff to allow that. But it also provides a way to implement access control. So if you want to only allow someone with a certain token or someone in a certain group or something like that to access web pages, even on the server, you can actually use Lit protocol. I've combined Lit protocol with Next.js on servers using server-side rendering, and it actually works really well, and wasn't hard to get up and running. One of my favorite things that has come out lately is Lens protocol. Lens is a social graph, And a social graph essentially allows you to build applications like YouTube, TikTok, et cetera. And with Lens, you can either fork their code base and deploy it on any network that you would like, or you can actually build a front end using the protocol's deployment on Polygon. And their Polygon deployment has dozens of user interfaces already built on top of it. So you can just say, okay, I want to build a new version of maybe like a YouTube or something like that, and you don't actually have to build out the back end at all. All you do is go to their docs. They have a really nice GraphQL API. They have an actual centralized API that sits in between the user interface and the blockchain that does a lot of the things that you might need in the traditional tech world, but it also gives you the option of going directly to the chain to interact. Some of those things are gasless transactions. So they subsidize transactions, meaning anyone in the world doesn't have to have tokens. They can just go to the Lens protocol if they have an account. They can have a wallet, and they can start writing and reading information from the chain, which I think is going to be kind of how we onboard the next large number of users into Web3 in the future. They also have a dispatcher, which is really, really great because in most traditional blockchain applications, every time you do an interaction, you actually have to sign that transaction, which is not a good user experience. With Lens, they have a dispatcher set up to where you can kind of just say, okay, I want to allow this application to sign on my behalf, and it'll kind of like set aside a really small amount of gas. And then from there, you can just kind of like things and retweet things and et cetera, and it doesn't ask you to sign. So the user experience is really nice. People are building out a lot of great SDKs on top of Lens. So this is one example, Lens.js. It's just a really quick way to kind of use Lens. When you're using Lens, you have these GraphQL queries that are like this long, but with this library, it kind of like makes it smaller, and you can kind of be having a little less code in your app. The Graph client is a GraphQL client for working with the graph, and I'm going to jump through the rest of these fairly quickly because we're getting close on time. Rainbow Kit is a really great way to integrate a nice wallet interface in your app with only a few lines of code. And this is becoming really, really popular. It uses Wallet Connect, which I'll go over in just a moment. Bundler allows you to use Arweave, the protocol I just talked about a moment ago, using tokens that most people already have in their wallet. So it's kind of like a protocol on top of Arweave that allows you to store files, and you can interact with the network using EVM tokens like Optimism or Polygon. And it's also cheaper for most transactions that are below a certain size because it's essentially working like a roll-up because it kind of like bundles transactions and then stores them to Arweave. WAGMI, or React hooks for Ethereum. This is kind of probably the go-to library for most people building JavaScript applications on the EVM at this point. Wallet Connect allows you to build mobile experiences and connect to your mobile wallets in your application, and on the user's device, I guess you could say. So if someone has MetaMask or Rainbow Wallet, Wallet Connect allows you to integrate that pretty easily. And then the last one I'll talk about is Biconomy. This is what Lens protocol is using to enable a relayer and gasless transactions. So this will allow you to kind of build, if you're building on a low-cost network like Polygon or maybe Arbitrum Nova, you can use something like Biconomy to pay for users' transactions to interact with your app. So therefore, you can kind of like onboard people that don't have the token that you're building that application on. So to wrap it up, I'll talk about a couple of ideas that you might consider building. Decentralized package manager, something like on top of Radical, but something like NPM. A specification for a recommendation algorithm for maybe something like a subgraph, because when we're building out these applications like Lens, we need to have feeds of data, and it's hard to decentralize a recommendation algorithm actually, but there are ways that you might be able to experiment there. Data archival, I think with Arweave is a new primitive that we've never really seen before, being able to store something forever. So people are already doing this in certain countries like China and even with the Ukraine war, where if you want to store something, you want it available forever. You might, I might use this like for my own photos of my children and stuff, just to have them available. I've actually built a couple of websites that are now available forever. There's all types of use cases, I think, for forever storage. Social graph applications, building front ends on top of Lens protocol. And then finally, this is something that's probably obvious to a lot of people, but yeah, just better developer tooling and abstractions using maybe some of the things that we went over and building on top of them. A good example of that is, I would say, Rainbow Kit uses a lot of dependencies that were there already. Lens.js uses a lot of code that was there already. Just kind of finding ways to kind of make the developer experience is a good thing to consider. And I'll close out with T. T is something that was built by Max Howell, who's the creator of Homebrew. Homebrew is something that is used by almost all developers that are on the command line. And he's kind of famous for getting rejected by Google after building Homebrew. And everyone at Google was using Homebrew, but he still kind of got rejected. And he tweeted about it, and that tweet just went crazy because that just shows you how broken the interview processes are in most places. Anyway, he's building a package registry on chain. The reason he's excited about Web3 is because he built a product, Homebrew, that probably created billions, if not tens or hundreds of billions of dollars in value, and he could not pay his bills because it was open source. So he had to go and find a job, and now he thinks that Web3 is probably an opportunity to help people that are like him monetize their work. So this is kind of an overview of T. It's free to use. It has characteristics that are, maybe somewhat interesting. To me, the most interesting thing is at the bottom is that package maintainers will be compensated via network rewards. And that means that if you install a package and it has 10 dependencies, he's building something into that. So all these sub-dependencies that are just used by everyone, somehow value flows to those people. And I think that that's a really huge, huge thing if you can make this work, because open source is broken. That's it. Thank you for coming to my talk and skipping Vitalik's talk.